Music playing, which means there's awkward silence on the stage, which means I need to fill it. Hi, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. My name is Laura Hunter. Welcome to day 2, part 2, something 2 of our security track. Pleased to introduce Mr. Ian Glazer, who is Ian and will be talking about interesting things. Please heckle him.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. It's a consistent pleasure to be able to come and talk to such smart people about so many different topics. And this has been one of the most fun decks to put together that I've ever done, as opposed to the self-loathing that I typically do. So I hope you have as much fun as I do. This is a weird talk, right? Why are we going to talk about things that people forget about? Well, if for no other reason than I have been consistently and incredibly wrong about many, many things in identity management. And so I built this habit of every so often taking one of these ideas off the shelf, shaking it and seeing if it still works. And some of this is around identifiers and usernames. And the other part is that my customers and part of my day job have been driving me over the last 18 months to think about usernames, which is not something I often did. And also we have an internal program that if I survive it along with our team, someday we'll be back to tell you about it. And it also involves identifiers and usernames. So usernames, right? We don't talk about this stuff. We really don't. But here's the thing, they are used every single day, thousands and thousands and thousands of times. It's like the most important thing we never ever talk about. We never do. I mean, usernames essentially get overshadowed by their big brothers like passwords or passwordless. Essentially, usernames are the Gen X of the identity world. Like they get their shit done and are completely overlooked. So here's the thing, you can't just not think about them. That's not cool, right? So let's at least spend the next 18 or so minutes talking about it. Just take 18 minutes out of your day to do this. Okay, there are 5 aspects to usernames. Usernames are not secrets. They have to be classified as public data, they have to be memorable, they have to be unique, and they have to be recoverable. So we're going to dive into all 5 aspects. First up, usernames cannot be secrets. So, as someone who's lived in Washington, D.C. for over 20 years now, I want to welcome you to D.C. There are amazing things that come from Washington, D.C. There is amazing food. Mambo sauce, which is essentially like an indigenous hot and sour sauce. D.C. The half smoke. Go down to Ben's Chili Bowl. It's a couple blocks away. Get yourself a chili half smoke. Trust me. We make amazing liquors, cider, beer. And DC is an amazing home of some music. So the home of Discord Records, Fugazi, Minor Threat, Bad Brains. Duke Ellington was born here. And then we have go-go music, which is totally unique to DC. So go get yourself a Chuck Brown album. Trust me, it will be in your party mix this summer. But there's not everything that comes from DC is awesome. For example, this. Yeah, so Social Security number. Originally, it was meant for employers to report wages of wage earners. That was its mission, 1938, that's the mission. And in 1943, the government's like, hey, this identifier is kind of handy. We should use it to use for everybody, not just wage earners, but like everybody. And it took until 2008 before the government changed that mandate. Oops. Now, so we now have expanded the purpose of what we're using this identifier for, this number for. And that's a problem because we knew it wasn't going to work, except we did it. Okay, fine. So it was a number, it pretty much worked as an identifier, and it worked pretty consistently. Here's the problem. 1972, the Social Security Administration just frankly gives up. You see, before 1972, the Social Security Administration, the card had not for identification on it. And they gave up. After that, in 1972, they took it off. Because every business realized, hey, this identifier is kind of useful, right? It mostly uniquely identifies people. And, you know, only the person's going to have their Social Security card, right? So, like, we can totally rely on this thing. Mistakes we did not know we were making. So here's the problem. This became every business's built-in secret, which means every business that started to use social security number was installing a breach damage amplifier every time they collected a record. It's just what we did. And so the SSN number is the canonical example of why identifiers cannot be secrets. If you assume that the identifier is a secret, guess what? If you think you have an identifier that is a secret, you do not have an identifier. You don't have a username. You have a zero-factor authenticator. The mere possession of this thing gives you access to something. It's a zero-factor authenticator. I'll give you an example. This was my employee ID number at IBM. The best guess I have is that IBM had 6 characters in the mainframe for employee ID number, and then they grew and they're like, shit, we'll go to hexadecimal. That's like the best option I can think of. Here's the thing, if you knew your employee ID number, you could actually, back in the day, unlock a little bit of resource in human resources. It was kind of mind-blowing, but just knowing this number was something that gave me access to something. It was a zero-factor authenticator. Second, usernames have to be classified as public. Now, here's the thing. If we just said that identifiers, usernames cannot be secret, what I'm saying is you actually, in your information classification scheme, have to classify these things as public data. And you're thinking, what? Well, first off, if you do this, then, well, if you classify it as public, it can't be a secret. Tautology of the day. But also, it will prevent you from putting attributes in the user's account into the username. It will prevent you from putting information that is not classified public in the username. Let me give you examples of places this happens, unfortunately. We tend to see things like membership numbers as usernames. Like many airlines, you have your frequent flyer number is your username. And arguably, that piece of information, that membership identifier number, is not something that is public, so you shouldn't use it as a username. Now, to be clear, I am saying you should classify usernames as public data. I am not, however, saying you should publicize your username. See, don't go get a billboard and like list everybody's account name. Like that's a bad idea. That's an enumeration attack on yourself. Not a best practice. But what happens at the intersection of secret and public? GDPR actually has an interesting implication here. So Article 4, Section 1 talks about what is personal information. And there's a great sentence in it, where great equals horrifying, which says personal information, blah, 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 such as a name, an ID number, or an online identifier. And in about 10 words, GDPR just made usernames really, really hard to deal with. In fact, here's the thing. I think GDPR fundamentally gets it wrong when it talks about identifiers. Because there are different types, and we'll talk about that, and they're processed differently. But the problem is, the way the regulation is written, it lacks that differentiation. It lacks nuance, and that makes handling usernames really hard. I have been working with the Salesforce GDPR program for 3+ years now, and I can tell you the extent to which we have had to deal with this problem is amazing, and I'm sure it is equally difficult in your enterprises as well. I think GDPR just got this wrong. Third aspect of usernames, they gotta be memorable. Now, this does not seem too controversial. Let's consider a memorable book. Moby Dick has a very memorable first sentence, which is, "Call me Ishmael." And I know in the audience you're thinking, oh, I know what he's doing. The important part's the Ishmael part, right? This is the important part? No. The call me part is. Why? Because the power to name is the power to control. And by naming himself, the narrator actually takes control from the reader and from the author for himself. The ability to name is part of self-determination. And this is hugely important to us as humans. So we have got to be able to give the ability for people to give themselves names. Now this is mandatory in B2C and B2B2C settings. But the reality is we should at least consider it in B2B and B2E as well. This is a very powerful and fundamental thing to us, and we need to be able to accommodate it. Now, here's the thing, that file faunalana is not self-determination. I mean, we're used to it, but it's not self-determination. And I can tell, even through the glare, people are like, what? You know this, right? File font Alana? You do. Trust me. Watch. See? It's simple. First letter, first name, last name. File font Alana. We live in this world, right? Like, how many people have, I don't know, a username that looks like this? Glazer. We grew up with this stuff, right? But here's the thing. We may be used to it, but file font Alana does not support self-determination. We're just habituated. Now, here's the thing. If you do not provide memorable usernames, what can you expect? Well, you can expect to have more on-screen help. You're going to need more customer support to deal with increased call volumes because people don't know what their username is. You're going to have a recovery problem. You should also expect re-registration. People come back to a site and be like, I don't know, I'll just register again. Emails are disposable, what the hell? And like, this is the worst thing that's possibly could happen to a marketer. They're like, oh my gosh, multiple people, but it's the same person. Like, don't do this. So you should also expect username reuse. Now, that's not entirely a bad thing from site to site. If it's memorable and I can remember it, I'll use it in multiple places. But when you couple that with the fact that people tend to reuse passwords, this actually accelerates the opportunity for account takeover. So that's something to be concerned about. Now, that means you've got to provide different kinds of choices, right? You want to provide, let's say you provide email as a username choice. But then on the very next screen, you ask, hey, how can I communicate with you? And the person's like, yeah, don't use email to talk to me. Well, that's super awkward. Like, I just got your email address and you're saying I can't. Duh. So because of that, I've got to think about alternative schemes of usernames. Not just email, but phone number, nickname. Right? We've got to expand our thinking about what is a username in our system. Now, the fourth aspect of usernames is they have to be unique. This better not be controversial, but wait, it gets worse. There's two ways things can be unique, and we have to think about both. The scope of uniqueness. Is your username, is that identifier unique in a tenant? If you're a multi-tenant service, in your service, in a namespace? Is it unique globally among all your systems? Is it meant to be unique universally? The important thing is not which one of these is it, it's do you know what scheme of uniqueness you're building towards? Right? So you've got to clearly at least ask yourself in system design time, do I know the uniqueness of this identifier? So in case we're ever going to say merge systems or acquire companies, we have a way of understanding what our uniqueness requirements are. Now, that knowing is really, really important. Most of us only need service scope uniqueness, but trust me, if you work in a large enterprise, just spend a minute thinking about the scope of your uniqueness. Now, the second aspect of uniqueness has to do with the type of identifier, and I've already alluded to this. You see, we have two kinds of usernames, or two kinds of identifiers, external and internal. Now, external identifiers, those are the things that people use to identify themselves to the system. It's an email address, it's a phone number, it's a nickname. And an internal identifier, well, that's the thing that the system essentially processes. So this is the way that the system thinks about that user. Here's the thing. The external identifiers live under the user's control. They live under a different life cycle than the ones that are issued by the enterprise in the system for it to process, right? These are different life cycles. Other thing that's kind of interesting is you can actually, if you allow for multiple kinds of usernames, you actually can have non-unique identifiers that map to a single unique identifier internally. So you actually can have a different cadence of uniqueness depending on the type and the system you've set up. One cautionary note. Let's say you use email address as your external identifier. You might be tempted to make it also the internal identifier. Do not do this ever. This is what Social Security number use did, right? This is the problem, as we strongly bound an identifier, its external identifier, to the internal identifier, and that is hell on earth if you ever want to pull it back out and change it. Do not do this. So let's talk about the intersection of memorable and unique, because there's some interesting interplay here. Things like an email address are memorable, but things like a did ID or UID are not. I'm kind of bludgeoning this point home, but here's the thing. That's okay. Why? because we have types. So external identifiers have to be memorable. The internal ones are never going to be. So don't worry about it if you're trying to make them all sort of memorable. I want to tell you a little story about an interesting intersection of memorable and unique. Some of you may be familiar with the comedian and actress Ilana Glazer. No relationship to me. Be very clear about that. She's super popular. Again, no relationship. We're both on Twitter. That's good. And she's done some amazing things. So she's been on Late Night with Stephen Colbert. She's been on like Glamour Magazine and People and MTV Music. She's got a unique username that's memorable, but not to everybody, because I get a lot of @ mentions that are super awkward, I have to say. It's awesome. The first time I found out I was on with Colbert, I'm like, oh my God, this is great. Never got those tickets. But this is a great example of file font Ilana striking, right? It's memorable, it's unique, we're so used to it, and yet it's not the right person. So there's some odd implications here. Fifth and final aspect of usernames, they gotta be recoverable. Now, when we talk about recovery of an account, we're talking about more than just reminding someone of their username, right? Because it's gotta actually be a process by which we reconnect a person to their digital stuff. This is how we have to think about recovery, because in fact, to do that, to reconnect someone, we probably have to reproof that person to make sure they are actually the appropriate human associated with their digital stuff. And the outcome of a recovery process may be not being able to reuse the same identifier. Well, why is that? Well, here's the thing. If you just remind me oh, hey, Ian, your username is, I don't know, that old work email address or the thing you used in GeoCities or that AIM handle, totally useless because I don't have access to that stuff anymore. Don't tell me that. That is so not actionable by an individual. You need to actually reconnect me here, which means I'm probably going to need to spawn a new username, but I still have the same digital stuff that I need to be connected to. So that's why you have to start thinking about things like backup usernames or multiple usernames in systems, especially in B2B environments. I'm not going to lie, that's tricky. That takes some thinking, but you've got to at least accommodate the opportunity for some flexibility there. Again, another reason not to make your external identifiers and your internal identifiers the same thing. The other thing is username reuse is a real thing. You see it in some email providers. You certainly see it in phone numbers. But this is kind of an interesting situation because in a reuse situation, the identifier has remained unique, but the person changed. That's weird from a systems perspective because that kind of looks like account takeover, but it's not. But it might be, but I don't know. And that's why recovery has got to be about reproofing the person, understanding are they the same human and reconnecting them if it's appropriate, or creating them a new account. So how do we actually select username schemes? If we take those 5 aspects as a guide, we can start to evaluate different kinds of schemes for usernames. Now, what do we want to take as our guidepost? One of them is memorable. Pretty obvious. I believe we've got to make sure that you respect self-determination. I also believe that you need to really focus on classifying these usernames as public data. You'd like them to help in their own recovery, right? So it'd be recovery deflecting. It's something that I can do and get back to easily. And ideally, I'd like them to be non-reusable, or at least I can measure their reusability because I may want something that isn't as prone to account takeover. And if we take these 5 goals as an evaluation matrix, then what we can do is we can actually plot different email username schemes against them. So things like email, super memorable, often very good in terms of respecting self-determination, mediocre when it comes to classified public, but always going to be reused, right? Go talk to the guys at Google, for example, always reusing that. So it's not horrible, it's not great. What about phone numbers? Well, phone numbers are kind of similar. They're not as great from self-determination. We don't often get a whole control over what our phone number looks like, but it's really bad from a classified public perspective. What about a nickname, right? Just a string of characters someone assigns to themselves. Actually really good Not often reused, definitely not classified public, but really increases your burden because they're not great from a recovery deflection perspective. All right, so what if we just generate a random string of characters? If we do that, a random character set, like really good from non-reuse, really good non-public, sucks from a recovery perspective because like you just never remember something that is just a random string of characters. And the lesson here is not that any one system is better than another, it's that if we superimpose all of this, it's going to be a balancing act. It's going to imply that probably you're going to want to offer choice to individuals to help them make their own determination what is most usable for them, what is most memorable for them. So, usernames. They're not secret. They have to be classified as public. They have to be memorable. They've got to be unique. And they've got to be recoverable. And what we're shooting for is the best scheme that can hit that 5-way Venn. We can evaluate our thought process around username schemes and think about things like we've seen here in terms of, does it help self-determination? Are they non-reusable? How well do they contribute to a recovery process? But it's always going to be a balancing act. And so here's the thing. At the end of the day, I believe, if you take nothing else from this talk, we have got to put the power to name in the hands of individuals, right? This is how we support self-determination. This is how we actually empower users. And so with that, call me Glazer. Thank you, everybody. Oh, I have to, with a huge thank you to the folks behind the screen, because what you don't know about the most optimistic clicker in the world is a light goes on and then a person back there advances my slides. There were 152 of them. Thank you guys very much. Questions while I'm standing here blinded? The gentleman right there. Laura, behind you. Or
how do you address the issue of filtering the usernames that people can select? Like, for example, if you're creating a Salesforce username, you probably don't want somebody to pick "I hate Salesforce" as a username. Profanity or something disparaging minorities or whatever.
yeah. So after this talk, I want you to come up and talk to my peers, because actually they've had to work through this process. And it's true anytime you launch a new service, there's going to be vanity names that people would like to have. Your executives are probably like, well, I don't want someone else to claim my username in this system, and I've got to block those out. And you're absolutely right. There's other considerations where trolls are going to do things that you don't want them to do. A combination of blacklist words to check for. You're going to want a reserved list, right, so that your executives' usernames are not taken by someone who aren't the executives. So it's a combination of things. But come by after and talk to my friend Matt and Raphael. They can give you some real-world experience on that. Other questions? 2 minutes back, everybody. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of Identiverse.